Dive right in. If you thought you were comfortable with complex theory, well, maybe brace yourself a little. We are looking at source material today that's just so conceptually ambitious, it feels like it doesn't just critique reality. It claims to offer, I don't know, the instruction manual for actually engineering a new one. Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take that kind of intellectual density and hopefully translate it into practical knowledge, or at least understandable insights for you. Today, our sources map out this revolutionary, maybe even audacious intellectual landscape. It's called the DTT Double Transverse Transjective Quadratic Model Theory. And look, this isn't just some fancy academic phrase. The material suggests it's a total systems overhaul. We're drawing from an excerpt here, detailing a thesis on something called non-autoanthropology and also a dissertation focused on the Kenemagorian mansion. Taken together, they present this incredibly comprehensive framework. It seems designed to fundamentally rethink, well, pretty much everything. Biological metabolism, sure, but also post-colonial culture, linguistic structure, even political governance. It's presented as philosophical engineering that, and this is the kicker, claims to have moved from pure theory to concrete, realized action. So our mission today, it's challenging, definitely, but being this engine of change, and finally, its specific reported realization, apparently, in Sierra Leone. We really want to give you, by the end of this deep dive, the clearest possible route to understanding the, let's say, architecture of this world-changing thesis.
And that clarity is absolutely essential, I think, because this material, it really operates at the intersection of, gosh, maybe half a dozen disciplines. You see physics, mathematics, anthropology, linguistics, all treated as these integrated tools for social transformation. What feels really unique here is the scope. This isn't just, academics theorizing in a vacuum. The claim is that it's the actual construction of a self-regulating, reality-revising system. We're looking at philosophical engineering in action, as you said. It's like a detailed roadmap for building something they call a prometopia, and it starts from the most basic structures, the flow of energy, the grammar of communication. It seems to want to move past just observing culture and go straight into designing it, ensuring it can sustain itself through these built-in mechanisms for like self-correction and specifically non-colonial governance.
Okay, let's jump straight into that foundation then. The core, defined by that, well, incredible title. The DT core, Double Transverse Transjective Quadratic Model Theory. DT at it sounds neat, but those words, they really demand some heavy scrutiny. So let's unpack the core model itself. What exactly is the function of this theory, and how do those, mathematical and directional words shape what it's trying to do?
Right. So when we talk about a model theory, we're generally talking about a formal, structured way of describing how a system behaves, maybe its potential outcomes. But this DT model, it's immediately complex just from its structural parts. Let's start with those directional terms. Double transverse. Okay, so if you think about a typical colonial or industrial model, maybe it's vertical, right? Hierarchical, or maybe linear, just one path forward. Transverse suggests moving across boundaries, like cutting sideways through existing structures.
Sideways, okay.
Yeah. And the double part, that's really the kicker. It suggests this movement happens simultaneously along two fundamental, maybe interdependent axes. Imagine systems operating in parallel sync, like, say, economic flow and cultural evolution, both cutting transversely across the old norms.
Ah, okay, so it stops the model from being too simple, like change in one area has to connect to change in another.
Exactly. It prevents that kind of reductionism. It ensures that transformation in, say, governance is immediately and necessarily linked to transformation in maybe aesthetics or culture.
So it's not just stepping outside the box once, but kind of doing it in two directions at the same time to make sure the whole system changes. It's like a mechanism built to avoid the usual traps of single-focus revolutions.
Precisely. That seems to be the idea. And then you've got the predictive element, or maybe directional element, the transjective quadratic model. Now, transjective, that's crucial. It seems to assert that the process moves beyond just the immediate reality we can measure right now. It pushes towards a desired future potential state.
So it's got a goal in mind.
Definitely. It's inherently teleological, you could say. Aims squarely at an end goal, which they explicitly call the prometopia. Now, the quadratic part, this is maybe the most radical structural claim in the whole name. It immediately signals something nonlinear, maybe exponential dynamics. Think about it. If a linear system means input x gives you result y, a quadratic system suggests input x could yield result y squared.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's a model seemingly built for systemic, rapid acceleration. It implies that maybe small, focused inputs, like creating a new word perhaps, or restructuring just one bit of grammar, could have these massively amplified, system-wide, revolutionary results. It's about leveraging small changes for maximum speed towards that transjective future.
Okay, that immediately brings up a huge question for me, especially given how ambitious this whole thing sounds. If the model is quadratic, built for exponential amplification, how does it manage risk? I mean, exponential dynamics can go spectacularly wrong just as easily as they go right. What stops this rapid acceleration from just causing a total system collapse? Are there mechanisms, maybe besides the ethical ones we'll get to later, that prevent that?
That's a really good question, and I think that's where the subsequent elements, especially this focus on rhythms we'll discuss, come into play. The system seems designed to mitigate that risk by ensuring the exponential change happens within a highly regulated, internally synchronized field. The goal is rapid transformation, yes, but not chaos. The DTT framework seems to be a model for revolutionary speed, but that speed is governed, supposedly, by internal feedback loops, and these loops are rooted in things like humility and homeostasis, concepts we'll explore. So the quadratic function, maybe it's applied more to the transformative outputs, not just randomly to input resources. It accelerates the realization of the prometopia, and that state itself is defined by these stable rhythms.
Okay, that makes sense. It's controlled acceleration. So let's look at what this whole accelerating transverse model is actually studying, or maybe defining. It's right there in the subtitle in parentheses. Living flat metabolism. Now, metabolism, we usually think biologically, right? The energy system of an organism. What does scaling this idea up and calling it flat metabolism mean in this context of post-colonial engineering?
Well, this concept is arguably one of the most fundamental critiques of inherited colonial systems that you find in the material. Metabolism, when you scale it up like this, it defines how a community or a nation or a whole culture gets resources, how it processes knowledge, transforms materials, distributes the outputs, everything. Traditional systems, especially the colonial ones they're reacting against, are usually designed vertically, hierarchically, and often extractively. Resources flow from the edges up to the center of power, and decisions flow down.
The classic model.
Exactly. The modifier flat here performs this really radical structural reversal. You should think of it less like a simple 2D surface, and maybe more like a rhizome, like a root network, or perhaps like a peer-to-peer distributed ledger in tech terms. It refers to a decentralized, non-hierarchical flow of energy, knowledge, resources, all within a living system. Imagine, maybe, a highly distributed power grid instead of one massive, centralized power plant.
So flat means every point in the network, maybe every individual or community, has an equal ability to process, transform, and share resources without needing permission from some central authority. It sounds like a complete dismantling of that vertical extractive setup.
Exactly. That seems to be the design goal. It's specifically engineered to bypass the bottlenecks and the extractive infrastructures inherited from colonial centralization. In a flat metabolic system, things like knowledge, wealth, energy, they're meant to diffuse horizontally, equitably. The system can still achieve high complexity, but that complexity is managed by decentralized intelligence, not central command. This flat metabolism is meant to ensure that the energetic basis of the new culture, the prometopia, is fundamentally equitable and also resilient against power concentrating again.
Okay, this leads us pretty naturally to the core theoretical statement then, the thesis itself. Non-auto anthropology, sacramental. If the goal is to define a whole new human society, why the negative prefix non-auto, and why this really heavy religious-sounding word, sacramental?
The non-auto seems crucial. It feels like a necessary intellectual protection almost against the biases embedded in Western knowledge production. Think about traditional anthropology, especially the kind that grew up during the colonial era. It often defaulted to what you could call auto-anthropology.
Meaning self-anthropology, studying from your own perspective.
Right. A self-referential study where the observers own Western cultural norms, their ways of knowing, their standards, they become the unexamined default. Everything else, the other, is measured against that. It's a closed loop that tends to reinforce colonial power structures even when it tries to be critical. So non-auto anthropology fundamentally rejects that self-referential isolation. It insists that the true study of humanity, especially in a post-colonial setting, has to start by moving radically outside one's own cultural and epistemological boundaries. It seems to demand a systematic erasure of the researcher's self as the main yardstick for truth.
And then adding the sacramental modifier.
Yeah.
What does that do to the whole inquiry? That feels like a massive step up from just academic observation.
It really does. It elevates the whole process beyond just collecting data or, detached scientific observation. To treat the subject of study the culture, the knowledge systems, the people as sacramental means it's revered. It possesses intrinsic power. And the very act of engaging with it becomes the sacred, transformative process in itself.
So it's not analyzing something passive.
Not at all. It's about participating in a system that has profound living value. This fundamentally shifts the relationship. The goal isn't data extraction or writing an objective summary. It's framed as a process of transformation for both the researcher and the research community. It demands this deep intellectual humility, which, as we'll see later, becomes the ultimate stabilizing factor for the entire system they propose. It means the work has to be done with reverence, aligning the process with the cultural and spiritual values of the people involved.
That sacramental mandate, it sounds like it could be the ethical brake needed to manage that exponential quadratic acceleration we were talking about earlier. But let me push on this a bit. In practice, how does non-auto anthropology guarantee that the researcher, even if they're deeply embedded, doesn't just swap the old colonial gaze for a new, maybe equally imposed sacred interpretation of what's going on? Isn't there a risk there?
That's always the challenge with any engaged research, isn't it? And the thesis seems to anticipate this by linking the theory directly to the methodology of the flat system itself. The guarantee, or maybe the safeguard, is built into the structure of how the study site itself is conceptualized. It's treated as a palimpsest manifest. The research isn't done by some lone outsider imposing meaning. It's intrinsically linked to the site, which gets detailed in the dissertation part. Kenema Mansion, Maison Palimpsest Manifest.
Okay, that title really grounds the abstract theory.
It does. Kenema Mansion Maison tells us the research is rooted in a specific place, a structure, a dwelling, the Maison within the Kenema district of Sierra Leone. Focusing on a localized domestic structure, A mansion, which implies layered history, maybe accumulated presence, helps ensure the study doesn't become too general or abstract.
And the metaphor there, the palimpsest manifest, that defines the approach to the site. A palimpsest, for anyone listening, is like an old manuscript where they scraped off the original writing to write something new, but you can still see traces of the old text underneath. Does that apply to a mansion and its culture?
It means the mansion, and by extension, the whole kenema cultural reality they're looking at, is treated like one of those layered documents, a legible text. The building itself, the materials used, the community practices around it, the political history impacting it, these are all seen as layers. The indigenous and pre-colonial structures, ways of being, are visible beneath the overlay of, say, colonial administration or modern development. And by calling it a manifest, the theorists are saying these layers aren't hidden or subconscious, they're right there, visible, available for analysis, and crucially, for engineering.
Ah, so it's not just reading the past, it's using those layers.
Precisely. The mansion becomes the physical embodiment of the tension between the old systems and the ones that came after. The research project then involves reading this layered history to find the ancestral wisdom, the oldest text layer, if you will, that can then be amplified by their quadratic model to kind of jumpstart this prometopia. It becomes the living laboratory where that sacramental engagement meets real-world structural change.
Okay, so we've got the theory framework, DT-TOR. We've got the anti-colonial, non-hierarchical flow idea, the flat metabolism. And we have the sacred study site, the palimpsest mansion. Now let's move from theory to the actual practice, the methodology operating within that layered place. How do you actually make change happen in a system that's described as so complex and layered? What's the mechanism? And the source gives us this core operating mechanism defined by possibly the most conceptually dense phrase in the whole thing: transversal, transjective, flactus-pulse-centric homeorhythms. Wow, that's not just descriptive. It sounds like the full technical spec for a cultural movement. We definitely need to synthesize these composite rhythms.
Absolutely. I mean, this single phrase, it really seems intended as the methodological blueprint. It feels designed to harmonize incredible complexity, but without centralizing control, aiming to ensure change is both radical and stable. Let's try to decipher it piece by piece, starting with the bits we've touched on. Transversal and transjective, these just reiterate that basic aim of the DT model. Moving across boundaries, pushing towards that desired future state, the prometopia, the rhythms have to be designed to constantly push past the, let's say, gravitational pull of inherited colonial limits.
Okay, so directionality and boundary crossing. Got it.
Right. Now for the structural modifiers, first we hit flatrizo polycentric. We know flat means non-hierarchy, decentralized power. Rhizomatic, that's a concept borrowed from botany, also philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari, famously. If traditional Western systems are often pictured like a tree, single central trunk, branches.
Top, top, top.
Exactly. The rhizome is different. It's more like a root system, maybe ginger or certain grasses, where any point can connect to any other point, like a network of fungus underground. There's no single origin, no main trunk. And if you cut one piece off, the rest of the system stays interconnected and functional.
That sounds like a perfect recipe for resilience.
Yeah.
It means taking out one node, one center of power, doesn't kill the whole transformation. That addresses the fragility you often see in centralized revolutions, doesn't it?
It seems designed to, and coupled right with that is polycentric, which just means many centers. It underscores that power, decision-making, knowledge transformation, all of it is distributed among multiple centers of gravity, maybe multiple communities or initiatives. So these rhythms operate simultaneously across various local projects, ensuring the transformation is genuinely grassroots, decentralized, and actively resists forming a new central elite that just extracts value again.
Many centers, all interconnected like roots, all moving across boundaries towards a goal. Yeah, okay, what about the last part?
The final piece is that the rhythms must be homeorhythms. This looks like the stabilizing mechanism. Homeo obviously points to homeostasis, that tendency of a system, especially a living one, to maintain internal stability, equilibrium, by adjusting to changing conditions. So these rhythms are designed to be self-regulating, self-stabilizing. The idea is that even as the system accelerates and transforms, remember the quadratic part, these internal feedback loops ensure harmony and prevent the system from basically tearing itself apart under the stress of rapid change. It's radical acceleration balanced by constant organic self-stabilization.
So the whole methodology is a self-regulating, distributed, interconnected network of knowledge and energy, constantly pushing toward a future state, doing it in a balanced way. It sounds designed to transform the system without needing constant external management or some central steering committee.
Precisely. That seems to be the core idea. And the genius, or at least the ambition of the DT Shrimp framework, is how it specifies where these complex rhythms are applied. They are applied through radical unschooling within ancestral wisdom and cosmology. This anchors the transformation firmly in the realm of knowledge and learning, or unlearning.
Radical unschooling, that's a really forceful term. It sounds like more than just changing the curriculum. It suggests a total, almost epistemic insurgency against the conventional institution of school itself. What does that look like when it's embedded specifically in ancestral wisdom?
Well, it appears to be a complete rejection of conventional institutional teaching methods, because in a post-colonial context, those methods often act as a continuation of intellectual colonialism, right? Prioritizing Western standardized knowledge, ignoring or actively devaluing local ways of knowing, local languages, local practices. So radical unschooling here seems aimed at deinstitutionalizing learning entirely. Knowledge acquisition moves out of the centralized classroom and back into the community, the family, maybe ritual spaces, the living environment. The palimpsest mansion itself becomes a site of learning. And by embedding this within ancestral wisdom and cosmology, the system tries to establish establish a new sovereign value system for knowledge. The argument is that the expertise needed for a sustainable, equitable life already exists in the local, generational, indigenous knowledge base. This process is about restoring that as the primary generative source of learning and knowing.
So the rhythms provide the decentralized structure, and the content flowing through that structure is the ancestral knowledge itself.
Okay, but then how does this unschooling, this rejection of traditional institutional measures, how does it gauge success? If they're accelerating, as the model says, they must have some way to know if they're actually moving towards the prometopia.
That's right. The measures of success have to fundamentally shift away from things like standardized test scores or GDP growth, the typical metrics of the colonial or neocolonial paradigm. Success within this framework seems to be measured by the efficacy of the homeorhythms themselves. Are the community resources flowing equitably? Is that flat metabolism working? Is the new language, which we'll get to, being actively used to construct new realities? Is the system maintaining internal harmony while still accelerating towards those defined transjective goals? The success metric appears to be fundamentally ontological. Have we, as a collective, actually begun living the new reality that's being forged by this new language and these new rhythms? That's the measure. All right, we have the complex structural model, DTM. We have the decentralized method, those rhythms. The next really big question is, what's the actual lever you pull to make the change happen? How do you kickstart this shift from the old reality, the one embedded in the palimpsest, to the new promised reality? And the source is very clear on this. It asserts that language itself is the primary engine, the core mechanism for this entire transition. The process gets this incredible name, etymological hybridization, hyperorganon, as ontological engineering insurgency. Wow, that's just breathtaking in its ambition. It frames the whole effort as ontological engineering, literally the deliberate construction or reshaping of the very nature of existence, and says it's done using language tools.
This really is the bedrock concept, I think, of the whole DT framework. The argument is that reality isn't something we just passively receive. It's something we actively construct through the language we have, the concepts we prioritize, the grammatical structures we use every day. So if you want to fundamentally change the structures of power or wealth or belief, the argument goes, you simply cannot do it using the grammar and vocabulary that were forged by the very system you want to dismantle. The tools themselves are part of the problem.
So ontological engineering, it's like writing the code for reality itself. If the old language is like a buggy, limited operating system that only lets you build hierarchical power structures, you need to develop a whole new programming language to code a flat, equitable reality. Is that the idea?
That's a great analogy, yes. And the specific programming language, the tool they highlight, is etymological hybridization. Now, what does fusing word origins achieve that just making up new words, neologisms, might not?
Good question.
Etymological hybridization is presented as the specific high-leverage technique. It means deliberately fusing different word origins, maybe combining indigenous concepts with repurposed technical or philosophical terms, or merging distinct linguistic practices from different traditions. The goal is to create new, dynamic meanings that fundamentally break the limitations of the inherited vocabulary. The reason this is seen as necessary is profound. The old language, the inherited colonial tongue, is semantically constrained, you could argue. It only really allows for the perception and discussion of realities already structured by that system. By hybridizing words, you force a kind of cognitive break, opening up semantic space for realities that were previously perhaps unthinkable or literally unspeakable.
And that term in brackets, hyperorganon,
Yeah.
that really reinforces the power they attribute to this technique. You mentioned an organon is like a tool of thought, Aristotle's logic system, calling this a hyperorganon. They're positioning etymological hybridization as the ultimate, the supreme instrument for social change.
It certainly seems that way. It's presented as the ultimate leverage point. If you change the very tool used for thought, you change everything that can be thought, everything that's considered possible. And the whole process is called an insurgency because it's framed as a direct revolutionary act against the existing linguistic and conceptual order. It's a cognitive rebellion that has to happen before or alongside the political one.
Okay, so if the hyperorganon is the ultimate tool, how does it actually operate on a daily level within the community? The source gives us what looks like the operational manifesto for this. Wordplay neologism of verbokinetic verb forging syntax revolutionary assemblage movement. Let's try and break down the mechanics of this linguistic revolution step by step.
Right. This phrase seems to describe the whole process, from the spark of creativity right through to collective action. It looks like it identifies 4 interconnected stages, or maybe aspects, of linguistic action. First, the foundation is set by wordplay neologism. This emphasizes that creating new, reality-shaping words isn't supposed to be some serious, top-down academic exercise. It's driven by creativity, maybe lightness, cultural resonance. The new words are born of play, which implies they're accessible, maybe joyful, collectively owned, and that links back nicely to the joyful part of their political vision we'll get to.
That makes sense. If the language isn't fun and something people want to participate in, it's probably not going to gain the critical mass needed to drive a whole revolutionary movement.
Precisely. Then second, we get to the mechanism of action. Verbokinetic verb forging syntax. This is where the real engineering seems to happen. Verbokinetic. Kinesis means movement. So this means language that moves, language that enacts change. The words themselves are seen as having kinetic energy. They don't just describe the world, they actively move it, shifting structures, shifting potentials.
Wow, words as movers.
Yeah. And this kinetic energy is channeled through verb forging syntax. This implies that the community is constantly actively shaping and structuring forging, like metal. The very rules of sentence construction, the syntax itself. If the inherited grammar was rigid, maybe hierarchical, the new syntax is presented as flexible, always being remolded by its users. It's about structuring language so that every collective communication becomes an active, kinetic step in building the new reality.
That is an absolutely astonishing concept. The idea that the community doesn't just invent new nouns for things, but actively changes the grammar of causality, how sentences are put together. The sentence structure itself becomes like the construction worker beating the prometopia.
Exactly. It turns the act of speaking into a political act, an ontological performance. If the old syntax made it easy and natural to talk about hierarchy and extraction, the new syntax must be forged to make it grammatically natural and simple to speak about flatness, equity, those homeorhythms. And the culmination of all these practices, the fourth stage, is the revolutionary assemblage movement. This confirms that the result of all this linguistic engineering isn't just new words or sentences, but a unified, transformative social movement. The collective creation and use of this new, reality-shaping language is the societal change. It's collective action centered fundamentally around a new grammar and vocabulary.
It's fascinating how the very technical nature of the DTMU model seems to demand such a deeply personalized grassroots engagement tool, like wordplay and messing with sentence structure. Okay, now we understand the engine, this linguistic insurgency, but we need to know the direction it's heading. What's the ideological framework guiding this quadratic acceleration, this verb-forging syntax? The force gives us a pretty clear name for it: joyful, Afro-optimist-oriented accelerationism, JAOA. Now, accelerationism, historically, that's a pretty loaded term, isn't it? Often associated with speeding up capitalism or technology, sometimes regardless of the social or ethical costs. But here we have these crucial modifiers, joyful and Afro-optimist. How do these terms work to salvage or maybe redefine accelerationism within this DT-PAR framework?
Those modifiers seem absolutely structural, not just tacked on. Traditional accelerationism, as you say, often carries that kind of nihilistic or ruthless edge. It focuses on speed, sometimes as a necessary destructive force, just to get to some undefined next stage. JAOA, however, is presented as ethically and geographically grounded. The Afro-optimist part ensures the acceleration is focused specifically on African futures. It seems rooted in a sovereign belief that indigenous African epistemologies, the ones suppressed by colonialism, actually provide a superior foundation, a better logic, for achieving genuine post-colonial liberation.
So it's accelerating towards self-defined African futures, not just Western models, faster.
Exactly. Bypassing outdated Western models of development seems key. And then the joyful element that appears to directly counter the traditional ruthlessness you mentioned. It implies that the process of change itself must be life-affirming.
The journey has to be good, not just the destination.
That seems to be the idea. The joyful modifier acts almost like a core design parameter for the whole DT2 model. It mandates that the drive toward the future has to be rooted in positive, regenerative feelings, positive affect. The change can't rely on austerity or suffering or forced sacrifice, which are often the hallmarks of colonial extraction and many top-down development schemes. Joy itself becomes positioned as a critical revolutionary force, ensuring the ethical maintenance of the whole movement.
Okay, but let me play the skeptic again for a moment. We've established the model is quadratic, exponential, and explicitly accelerationist. Revolutions historically are often brutal, and speed usually demands really difficult choices. How does the thesis guarantee that when things get tough, this joyful approach doesn't just become a kind of mask for necessary, perhaps painful compromises? Or that the sheer speed doesn't end up marginalizing the very people the flat metabolism was supposed to serve?
That tension, I think, is intentionally built into the model, and the answer they seem to provide lies back in the structural framework we've already discussed. The joyful element is maintained because the system is designed to be flat. Think about it. If the system were centralized, acceleration would almost always favor the center, inevitably leading to suffering at the edges, forcing any joy to be superficial or propagandistic. But because the metabolism and the rhythms are explicitly designed as flat, rhizomatic, and polycentric, acceleration is supposed to benefit all nodes, all participants, more or less simultaneously.
So the joy is decentralized too.
That's the idea. It's organic, not imposed from above. If the system starts failing to nourish joy, if it becomes oppressive, the homeorhythm should theoretically destabilize, and those built-in homeostatic mechanisms would trigger correction. The architecture itself is meant to guarantee the ethical commitment to joy. And this brings us nicely to the aesthetic output of this whole ideological drive. If JAOA is the philosophy guiding it, the art form, the cultural expression, is called flatafrotheopoetics, Play-Lasoda. This is presented as the concrete cultural manifestation of that verb-forging syntax we talked about.
Right, flatafrotheopoetics. That's another one of those triple compound terms describing an aesthetic. Let's break down its components again. What do they signal about the kind of art produced in this new reality?
Okay, flatafrotheopoetics. Let's take it piece by piece as the aesthetic theory. Flat. This just reaffirms the decentralized nature again. Art isn't divided into high and low categories. It's not produced by some single central cultural elite. It emerges from the collective, mirroring that flat metabolism. Everyone potentially participates. Afro. This confirms the cultural grounding. It's rooted in African and Black experience, memory, and future projection. It's not aiming for some abstract global aesthetic, but one specifically tied to this geographic and cultural trajectory, this Afro-optimism. Theo. This points to the metaphysical link. It signals that this aesthetic expression connects back to the divine, the sacred, the cosmic, reinforcing that sacramental nature of the non-auto anthropology. This art is concerned with fundamental, perhaps spiritual realities, not just political or economic ones.
So it's art that's decentralized, culturally sovereign, and spiritually ambitious. A synthesis of the political, the cultural, and the sacred.
That seems to be the goal. And the specific neologism they use for the actual aesthetic output, the concrete result of all that etymological hybridization, is plela soda. What does this made-up word signify?
Yeah, plela soda. It sounds interesting.
It does. Plela soda is presented as the result of the linguistic engineering in practice. It's the concrete poetry, or the aesthetic practice, of the prometopia. Now, while it's a neologism defined internally by the thesis, we can speculate about its parts based on the sounds and context. It clearly incorporates play, that joyful, creative, maybe spontaneous element. Then La Soda. Well, it likely refers to logos, reason, structure, maybe philosophy. And perhaps the sound of soda is intentional, suggesting effervescence, dynamism, bubbling change, fizz.
Okay. Play plus logos plus soda.
Possibly. So play La Soda could be interpreted as the aesthetic practice where joyful, creative invention, play, meets rigorous philosophical and structural intent logos to generate dynamic, effervescent change, soda. It is the concrete, poetic proof, maybe, that the ontological engineering is successfully reshaping consciousness through beauty, through collective creative expression.
Okay, this is the section where, as they say, the theoretical rubber really hits the road. All of this incredibly dense, complex theory, the DT-Poor model, the hyperorganon, JAO, play soda, it all culminates in one extraordinarily powerful claim, which is detailed in point 8 of the source material. Prometopia of post-coloniality, neoculturation, play soda is successfully realized today in Kenema District, Sierra Leone. Wow. That shifts the entire framework from abstraction from theory to a highly specific, potentially verifiable claim of success. You aren't talking about a future goal here. The claim is successfully realized today. Let's try and synthesize what this realized state, this prometopia, is supposed to actually entail on the ground there in Kenema.
Well, the term prometopia itself feels like a very deliberate choice. It carefully avoids the potential rigidity of utopia, which can suggest a static, perfect, maybe even boring finished state. A prometopia, as the prose suggests, seems to mean a for-utopia, or maybe a stage of utopian realization that is inherently ongoing, still developing.
So it contains the promise of utopia within the current reality.
Exactly. The promise is embedded in the realization itself. This aligns perfectly with that JAOA ethos that's accelerated, meaning it's never truly finished, but constantly progressing towards even greater potential. The current realization is framed as just the robust platform for further acceleration. And the specific result they claim is post-coloniality neoculturation. This describes the political achievement, the assertion that the community has successfully forged a new, active culture built after and in direct structural opposition to colonial paradigms. It's a neoculturation, a culture that is specifically new, not just a revival of the pre-colonial past, but an engineered, forward-looking synthesis forged by that linguistic hyperorganon we discussed.
And the specific claim that play soda successfully realized this state seems critical. It underscores their argument that the success in Kenema was achieved not through, say, military force or traditional political maneuvering, but primarily through the cultural and linguistic mechanisms we've detailed, through that joyful kinetic word forging and the aesthetic restructuring of flat-afro theopoetics.
Absolutely. This grounding in the Kenema district is presented as the thesis's ultimate empirical proof. It asserts that this kind of ontological engineering is not just theoretical, but viable and sustainable in a specific, real-world, post-colonial context. But if the transformation is achieved, the next, and maybe even harder question comes up. How do you actually maintain a constantly accelerating, non-hierarchical, self-regulating revolution? Transformation is one thing, indefinite stability, especially under acceleration, is quite another.
All right, systems tend towards equilibrium or decay. How do they keep this going? The source addresses this through what it calls the subsequent mechanism of maintenance, introduced as a repercussion. Exopsychoanalytic form. Ontological engineering. Okay, we know ontological engineering is the reshaping of reality. What does it mean for this maintenance to be conducted in an exopsychoanalytic form?
This sounds like the dedicated maintenance crew, if you will, for the new reality. It implies that the collective ontology, the shared reality, is maintained not just internally, through individuals using the new language, etc., but also through an externalized critical psychoanalytic process applied to the collective.
Externalized, like group therapy for the whole culture.
Sort of, but maybe more structured and critical. Exo means external or outside. This seems to point to a mechanism for the community to critically examine its own collective psyche, its foundational assumptions, its emergent ontology, maybe from a slightly detached critical standpoint. Think of it like a mandatory, ongoing, collective psychological self-audit. It seems designed to spot and correct any lingering colonial residues, any internalized oppressions, or perhaps limiting thought patterns that might creep back in and undermine the prometopia. It externalizes the critical analysis needed for permanent self-correction.
So the community needs this structured, reflective, maybe even uncomfortable, outside-in process to stop the new culture from slowly drifting back towards the old, centralized, hierarchical structures it was designed to escape. It's like a built-in system to fight complacency.
Precisely. That appears to be the function. And this leads us right to the final and perhaps most complex and potentially controversial ethical component of this maintenance loop. Reflective panopticon, benevolence, and eschatological maintenance nourishing radical humility.
Okay, that juxtaposition is really striking and challenging. The panopticon, Foucault's concept, is historically associated with coercive control, total surveillance, a prison design meant to make inmates internalize discipline through the fear of always potentially being watched. How can this thesis possibly claim reflective panopticon benevolence? How does the source guarantee this self-observing system won't just naturally drift into repression and fear, even if its initial intent is supposedly benevolent? That seems like a huge risk.
It's a massive risk, and it's the crucial tension the thesis seems to embrace head-on, attempting to resolve it through redefinition. The panopticon concept here is seemingly stripped of its usual carceral centralizing function and redefined entirely by those crucial modifiers, reflective and benevolence. The idea seems to be a system where the community is constantly observable, a panopticon in that sense, but it's strictly self-observing and guided by ethical goodness and the collective interest, benevolence. And crucially, it's reflective. The surveillance isn't imposed by some external hidden authority. It's presented as an internalized mechanism for critical self-reflection and transparency, specifically for the purpose of maintaining the ethical flat structure. It monitors the collective ontology, ensuring it stays aligned with the foundational JOA principles, but it does so through, perhaps, mandated community self-review, open data, shared scrutiny, rather than hidden police enforcement.
So the panopticon, in this specific context, is repurposed as a structure for enforced transparency and continuous collective scrutiny, which arguably might be necessary when you're dealing with exponential, accelerating change in a decentralized system.
Exactly. It could be seen as a mechanism to ensure no single node, no individual or group in that rhizomatic network gains too much hidden influence, preventing the re-centralization of power. And this intense self-reflection is driven by eschatological maintenance. This means the maintenance isn't just focused on fixing current problems day to day, it's constantly looking towards the ultimate end goals, the philosophical destiny, the eschatology of the movement. Every act of maintenance, every correction, is viewed through the lens of maximizing the future potential of the prometopia.
It's maintenance driven by a sense of ultimate purpose, ensuring that quadratic acceleration stays pointed in the intended ethical direction.
Okay.
And what's the final ultimate ethical stabilizer for this incredibly sophisticated, constantly self-observing, accelerating system? It comes down to nourishing radical humility.
This feels like the ultimate synthesis, the capstone. Despite the sheer complexity of the DT apparatus, the immense power attributed to the linguistic hyperorganon, and the constant, maybe unnerving observation of the reflective panopticon, the entire system is claimed to be sustained and actively nourished by the simplest yet perhaps most radical virtue: humility. Radical humility here seems defined not as passive meekness or self-abasement, but as an active, fundamental recognition of one's own limits, one's interdependence, and one's position within the interconnected flat system. It's positioned as the ethical core that prevents the prometopia from collapsing into hubris or dogmatism or eventually authoritarianism, which are often the failure modes of systems that accumulate too much power or certainty. The humility keeps the powerful hyperorganon accountable to the collective. It keeps the panopticon reflective and benevolent rather than coercive.
It sounds like a feedback loop then. The decentralized flat structure necessitates radical humility to function, and that active practice of radical humility is what nourishes and maintains the decentralized structure. It's the necessary antidote, maybe, to the immense power potentially generated by quadratic acceleration and ontological engineering. Hashtag tag outro.
So when we try to synthesize this entire journey from start to finish, what really emerges is this brilliantly coherent, I have to say, if incredibly conceptually demanding overall structure. We started with that mathematical sounding model, the DT-tie double transverse transjective quadratic model theory. That established a nonlinear, decentralized approach to energy and information flow through the concept of flat metabolism. This model we saw was founded upon a non-auto anthropology that mandates this deep, maybe even sacred engagement with reality, the sacramental aspect. Then the whole system was activated, set in motion by the power of language, specifically etymological hybridization, framed as a hyperorganon. This generated new concepts through verb-forging syntax and found its cultural expression in the joyful aesthetics of Flattifro-theopoetics, or their term play soda. And then the big claim. All of this was supposedly successfully realized as a self-correcting prometopia in kenema, Sierra Leone. The ongoing stability of this accelerating system is then maintained by that exo-psychoanalytic form of ontological engineering and a self-aware structure of reflective panopticon benevolence. And the whole thing, incredibly, is stabilized and sustained by the core ethical commitment to actively nourishing radical humility.
It really is a profound, almost dizzying synthesis of complexity and simplicity. You have radical acceleration as thought, highly technical modeling from physics and math, fused with deep indigenous ancestral wisdom, all combined into a social structure that is actively engineered, constantly transforming, yet somehow structurally stabilized by the pursuit of that fundamental active virtue, humility. The entire premise of this DTTF theory, it really forces you, I think, to confront the power we maybe unconsciously assign to language every day. If, as they claim, a radical new reality can be engineered through something like wordplay, through creating a hyperorganon capable of forging grammar and syntax, what does that suggest about the languages, the metaphors, the dormant cultural concepts that you currently use, maybe without thinking, to describe your own limitations or your own potential?
And that raises, I think, a really important closing question for you, the listener. We generally tend to perceive humility as a passive quality, don't we? Maybe even a break on ambition, something that holds us back. But here, in this framework, radical humility is explicitly positioned as the force that nourishes the entire system of ontological engineering and acceleration. It's what ensures its longevity and its ethical compliance. So, if humility can function as an engine rather than just a brake for radical change, how might shifting your own perspective on the world, achieving your own goals, require you to first consciously change the basic vocabulary, the neologisms, the verb-forging syntax that you use to describe your reality and your future? The DTN theory seems to suggest that if you fundamentally change the grammar of possibility, maybe, just maybe, the world itself will follow. It's a challenging thought to end on.